Dennis Carroll was 62 years old and had worked his entire life. 36 years as a systems engineer in Seattle. Meetings, deadlines, complex decisions, technical reports that required sustained concentration for hours. The kind of brain-consuming work that Dennis had said he was tired of doing for years. In March 2021, he retired. The party was on Friday. The following Monday, he woke up without an alarm for the first time in decades, drank his coffee slowly, and stared at the garden. He was okay. Better than okay. Relieved. 18 months later, his wife Patricia took him to the neurologist because he was repeating the same stories in the same conversation without realizing it. Because he was forgetting appointments he had written down. Because he had stopped halfway to the market and couldn't remember why he had left home. The neurologist administered the tests. The results came back, and what was in the MRI scans and standardized cognitive scores was not the brain of a 62-year-old man who had just retired, rested, and healthy. It was the brain of a 72-year-old man. Dennis hadn't gotten sick. He hadn't suffered a stroke. He hadn't developed early-onset Alzheimer's due to documented genetic predisposition. He had done something that American culture treats as a reward, as destiny, as the goal of a lifetime of work. He had stopped using his brain intensely enough, and his brain had begun to shrink. The human brain is not a muscle, but it obeys the same law that governs muscles: use it or lose it. Neuroscience has a name for this principle: activity-dependent neuroplasticity, and what it means in practical terms is that brain tissue, synaptic connections, the volume of structures like the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex are biologically maintained in response to the cognitive demands that the environment places on them. When the demand ceases, when work stops, when complex decisions disappear, when intense intellectual stimulation is replaced by television, gardening, and comfortable routines, the brain does not rest. It regresses. Synaptic connections that are not used are eliminated by a process called synaptic pruning. The volume of the hippocampus, the most critical structure for memory formation, begins to decrease at a rate that in cognitively inactive adults is demonstrably faster than in cognitively engaged adults. Retirement is not the problem. The problem is what most people do with it. And what most people do is exactly what the culture says is the reward: stop, rest, have no obligations, no pressure, nothing that the brain needs to solve urgently. And the brain, without urgency, begins to reduce the infrastructure that urgency maintained. What the data from the English Longitudinal Study of Aging, ELSA, published in the journal PNAS in 2020, reveals about the rate of cognitive decline in adults who retire early versus adults who remain professionally or intellectually engaged will permanently change how you think about rest as a destination. But the neurobiological mechanism by which Dennis's brain aged 10 years and 18 months is the detail that no doctor mentions in the pre-retirement consultation, because medicine has no cognitive risk assessment protocol for the retirement transition. Patricia had noticed the first thing in September 2022, 6 months after retirement. Dennis had told the same story about a fishing trip twice at the same dinner, not in the same week, on the same night, at the same table, with the same people. And she hadn't noticed. She kept it to herself. Said it was distraction, said it was the wine. In December 2022, Dennis forgot the name of his neighbor's son, a boy who had grown up next door and whom Dennis had watched grow up for 15 years. The name simply wasn't there when he tried to access it. In March 2023, exactly 1 year after retirement, Dennis went to the doctor on his own with a complaint Patricia didn't know he had formulated: "I'm forgetting things I shouldn't forget." The general practitioner ordered routine blood tests: thyroid, vitamin B12, complete blood count. All normal. Said it was transition period stress. Said it was common. Said it would pass. Dennis went home. He continued without working. He continued without structured intellectual obligation. He continued waking up without an alarm and spending his days without significant cognitive demand. And the brain continued doing what brains do when there is no demand. It continued pruning what was not being used. There were two options in that March 2023 doctor's office. The first was to attribute the symptoms to transition stress, order basic tests, advise relaxation, and reassess in 6 months, which was chosen. The second was to consider that a 62-year-old patient, cognitively active for 36 consecutive years, had completely stopped any intellectually challenging activity 12 months prior, and was showing early signs of cognitive decline, and immediately refer him for a complete neuropsychological evaluation with imaging and biomarker tracking, in addition to prescribing in a structured way the only treatment available to slow down the process: intense and structured cognitive re-engagement. The doctor chose the first option, It was protocol. It was reasonable given the available data. It was what any general practitioner would have done. And Dennis had, at that moment, a window of partial reversal that narrowed with each passing week without intervention. The study that changed how neuroscience thinks about retirement and cognition was not conducted in an elite laboratory. It was conducted over 16 years with 3,433 British participants in the English longitudinal study of aging. In 2020, Vegard Skrbek and Sherry Merker, from the Norwegian Institute of Public Health, analyzed the data and published in PNAS the results that most public health policies have not yet fully processed. Early retirement, defined as before the age of 65, was associated with accelerated cognitive decline equivalent to a 38% reduction in mental processing speed and a 25% reduction in verbal memory over the 6 years following retirement, compared with adults who remained professionally or intellectually engaged during the same period. In participants who retired before the age of 60, like Dennis, the rate of acceleration of decline was even more pronounced in the first 2 years post-retirement, the period in which the brain makes the greatest structural adjustment to the new absence of demand. 38% reduction in processing speed in adults with no history of neurological disease, no risky genetic mutation, no predisposing factor other than having stopped working at the moment when the culture says it's time to stop. And here is the mechanism that transforms epidemiological data into personal neurobiological horror. The adult hippocampus maintains the capacity for neurogenesis, the creation of new neurons in response to specific factors, aerobic exercise, learning new and complex skills, and intense and varied cognitive stimulation. Without these factors, hippocampal neurogenesis ceases. And without neurogenesis, the hippocampus shrinks. In cognitively sedentary adults, the rate of hippocampal volume reduction documented by MRI is approximately 1% to 2% per year, compared to less than 0.5% in cognitively active adults. Dennis lost between 2.5% and 3% of his hippocampal volume in the 18 months between his retirement and the MRI that Patricia finally got the neurologist to order. In terms of functional equivalence, this corresponds to approximately 10 years of accelerated brain aging, exactly what the neurologist had documented in his scores. And the most disturbing research on the subject did not come from epidemiology. It came from a 2022 molecular study from the University of Edinburgh, published in Nature Neuroscience, led by researcher Emma Wood. Wood and her team demonstrated that adults who engage in learning new and complex skills, not passive entertainment, not television, not gardening, but active and challenging learning, had measurably higher synaptic density in the prefrontal cortex than age-matched controls who did not engage in structured learning. The difference in terms of biomarkers was equivalent to an 8 to 12-year chronological age range. Dennis's brain had shrunk because Dennis had done exactly what he had planned to do in retirement. Nothing that required real concentration. Nothing that required learning something new from scratch. Nothing that made him intellectually uncomfortable. And intellectual discomfort, neuroscience documents with increasing clarity, is the stimulus that keeps brain tissue structurally present. The paradox of Dennis's retirement was not in the rest. Rest was necessary. 36 years of intense professional pressure deserved a break. The problem was that the break had become permanent. And permanent, in the brain's vocabulary, means regression. The instinct to reward a lifetime of work with a total absence of intellectual obligation created exactly the conditions that Dennis's brain could not withstand without structural cost. Retirement was not the trigger for the disease. It was the trigger for the cessation of the stimulus that kept the brain functioning at the capacity it had maintained for 36 consecutive years. Dennis had spent more than 3 decades solving complex problems, learning new technologies, making decisions under pressure, teaching juniors, navigating organizational conflicts. Each of these activities was, neurologically, maintenance of brain infrastructure. When they all stopped at the same time, the brain began to dismantle what was no longer being used with the silent efficiency of a system that never wastes resources. Dennis had planned his retirement for years. He had calculated his pension, chosen the house, discussed the plans with Patricia. He had planned absolutely everything except what he was going to do with the brain he had built up over an entire career. What American neuroscience has learned from Dennis Carroll, from the ELSA data, from Wood's studies in Edinburgh, and from the millions of American retirees who experience accelerated cognitive decline in the first years after retirement is that the transition to retirement is a neurological risk event not recognized by the health system, and that early and structured intervention can partially reverse or significantly slow the process if initiated before the structural damage is extensive. What Dennis never received was the conversation that should have happened before March 2021. The conversation that no doctor has with any patient about to retire, because there is no protocol that requires this conversation. That no American public health policy provides for, because retirement is treated as a financial and labor event, not as a neurological risk event. In October 2023, 2.5 years after retirement, Dennis was enrolled by Patricia in a structured cognitive re-engagement program, learning Python programming from scratch, in-person competitive chess classes, and a weekly reading group with analytical discussion. 9 months later, follow-up neuropsychological tests showed stabilization of the decline and an 11% improvement in working memory scores. Stabilization, not complete reversal. What was built up during the 18 months of absence did not fully return, but what remains stopped being dismantled. Dennis learns Python 3 times a week now, not because he particularly likes programming, because the discomfort of learning something new from scratch is exactly the stimulus that the brain tissue that still exists needs to continue existing. Retirement has arrived. The protocol never came. The difference between retirement that preserves cognitive function and retirement that accelerates brain aging by 10 years is not favorable genetics, wealth, or luck. It's what you decide to do with the time that is finally yours. The absence of obligation cannot become the absence of intellectual challenge because for the brain, these two things are not equivalent. You can stop working. You cannot stop learning. If you are in the 5 years before retirement, or the first 2 years after, or know someone in that situation, the most important intervention is not supplements, not blood tests, and not medication. It is intentional cognitive structuring, learning a new skill that is complex enough to produce real discomfort, 3 to 5 times a week, consistently and progressively. Not entertainment reading, not educational television, not crossword puzzles, which neuroscience has already documented as insufficiently challenging to produce significant hippocampal neurogenesis. Real learning, new skill, musical instrument, language, programming, competitive chess. Anything that makes the brain work in a way it's not used to, because intellectual discomfort is the only signal the hippocampus recognizes as a reason to continue investing in infrastructure. Dennis learned this at 64, with 2.5 years of partially irreversible damage already accumulated, in a classroom with people 40 years younger learning the same programming language from scratch. You can learn it sooner. But retirement isn't the only life event not recognized by the American healthcare system as a neurological risk. In the next video, social isolation, what happens to the brain when meaningful human contact falls below a critical threshold, documented in neuroimaging, and why the American loneliness epidemic is producing measurable structural brain damage in middle-aged adults that no doctor is tracking as a cognitive risk factor.